So for a long time now, I felt the villains in Assassin's Creed have become very lackluster. A lot of these games struggle to write interesting and compelling villains. Assassin's Creed has always been better at giving us good protagonists, and I find it funny because another Ubisoft series in Far Cry has a lot of very compelling villains but weak protagonists. It's the complete opposite. Now don't get me wrong, there are some good villains in Assassin's Creed. I'd say there's about 4, maybe 5, being Mualim, Rodrigo, and Cesare Borgia, and Haytham if you want to consider him a villain. We'll just use the term antagonist. Those 4 make for some very good antagonists and villains for their respective games. And 3 of those 4 come from the first 3 Assassin's Creed games: Mualim, Rodrigo, and Cesare Borgia. And then obviously Haytham is in AC3, but I feel outside of those 4, there aren't really many good villains in this series at all. It's a problem that's become increasingly clear to me over the years, and having a good villain is pretty necessary to having a good story. The hero always needs some powerful villain or foil to overcome in these games. Some of the games in the series don't put too much importance or emphasis on a main villain, perfect examples being in Origins and most recently Mirage. The villains of those games are in only a few scenes, which I think is actually a big reason why so many of the villains in Assassin's Creed feel so lackluster. If you look at Mualim, Rodrigo, Cesare, and Haytham, they all have something in common that makes them more memorable villains/antagonists from the rest of the series. They have lots of screen time and a large presence in their respective games. The game clearly defines them as the main antagonists, and they appear in the beginning, middle, and end of the game. Even with a character like Mualim, who you believe is to be an ally for a majority of the game, he's still in the game a lot. Aside from Altair, he's the character with the most screen time, which is part of what makes that twist and betrayal so effective. Rodrigo is this big master planner and manipulator behind the scenes. Ezio spends years, decades even, chasing his shadow. He has such a massive and ominous presence whenever he's on the screen. Even at the beginning of the game, when you have no idea who he is, he's still lurking around in the background. And he's also responsible for the death of Ezio's family, giving Ezio and the player motivation to hunt him down. That's how you build up a really compelling villain. Cesare from Brotherhood doesn't really care to stick to the shadows like his father Rodrigo did, and he makes his presence felt in the game immediately. Invades Monteriggioni, kills Mario, again giving Ezio and the player a strong motivation to hate him. And he's present throughout the game. He doesn't just show up at the beginning and end, he's a constant part of the story. It also helps when you have such a strong and commanding performance from the voice actor as well. As for Haytham, this is especially interesting because rather than the game trying to make you hate him and seek vengeance, they want you to understand his point of view and even potentially like him. That's why you play as him to start the game, and why you get all these scenes where we get to hear Haytham's viewpoints, and why his beliefs align with the Templars over the Assassins. And again, he has such a commanding screen presence. The performance by Adrian Huff makes him feel so charismatic and likable. It's a different way of building up an antagonist from Rodrigo and Cesare, but it's just as effective, possibly even more so. And very importantly, Haytham is present through a vast majority of the game. He doesn't just pop up at the very end like a lot of these other villains in the series. And while we're on the topic of AC3, I honestly think Charles Lee is a pretty solid antagonist too, all things considered. The way you first see him as Haytham's faithful, loyal servant to just plain out terrible person through Connor's eyes, it's really interesting. And again, hunting him down is Connor's focus for a lot of the game. Maybe Basim in Valhalla is worth mentioning as well. There's a lot of antagonists in Valhalla, but Basim is the final boss. Again though, all of these villains I just mentioned are heavily present in each of their games. Meanwhile, a lot of the other main villains from the series barely appear in their own games. And when they're missing that screen time, that's how you end up with a lot of these forgettable, lackluster villains. I mean, how many people remember or talk about Prince Ahmet from Revelations? Like, that dude was just so forgettable. I feel like some people don't even remember he was the main antagonist of that game. And with Origins and Mirage specifically, the stories of those games are structured so that you don't find out who the main villain really is until the end of the game. Spoiler warning here, by the way, for both games, but for Origins, this is Flavius, and for Mirage, Kabiha. They were the leaders of the Order and were pulling the strings all along, strong, and both of them are just very mediocre villains to me. Again, I think Kabiha is in 3, maybe 4 scenes in the entire game before she's killed after finally getting interesting. Like, yeah, the game did show her before the reveal that she was the leader of the Order, but barely, and it wasn't like this shocking twist or betrayal when you find out she's the leader. The reaction is kind of like, oh, her? She's the leader? Okay. Exactly the same thing with Flavius. He's shown briefly before the reveal, but when it happens, you're not really shocked like with the Mualim twist from AC1. These villains come and go so fast that they don't even really get the chance to be fleshed out as characters or get a good understanding for what their motivations and goals actually are, which is why they feel so weak in comparison to a Rodrigo Borgia or a Haytham Kenway. Kabiha did at least push Basim's story forward, and if you really want to look at it from a different perspective, you could say Basim became the villain in the end. I don't really see it that way, but he definitely falls under that gray area. Screen time and presence aren't the only factors that make for a good villain though, obviously. A villain can be very present and involved in a game's story and still fall flat. Crawford Starrick is probably the perfect example of that for Assassin's Creed. I'm not gonna lie, Starrick is probably my least favorite villain in the entire series. I say it so much, but the guy feels like a villain ripped straight out of a cartoon. Never mind the fact that he actually looks like one, but he's just so laughably evil that I could never take him seriously. He shoots one of his own henchmen for interrupting him while mournfully playing the piano. The game tries to make him feel like this big, evil, intimidating villain who controls London and is pulling all the strings. I mean, the game literally straight up tells you this in an exposition dump when you start the game.
His name is Crawford Starrick, and he intends to rule the world.
But to me, he's more annoying than intimidating. He makes Charles Lee look like a genius. His motivations are extremely shallow. He wants to rule the world, to make it a better place, I guess. Sure, why not? And he's so over the top and ridiculous that I could just never take him seriously. He's like a knockoff version of Cesare. You can have a crazy psychotic villain while still making them feel grounded and intimidating. Cesare wants to take over the world too, but you just accept the fact that he was born with a couple screws loose. The other thing with Starrick is all his scenes are just in his office as he sits back and does nothing while Jacob and Evie cripple his empire. And he doesn't even meet Jacob and Evie until the final mission. Anyways, that's enough about Starrick. But while I think the main issue with a lot of these villains in the series is lack of presence and screen time, there are plenty of other factors. Performances are very important, obviously. Motivations, their connection to the protagonist. If they're meant to be more of an empathetic villain like Haytham or Robert de Sable, you need to make them actually likable and understandable. A lot of villains in this series fall short of a lot of that criteria, and when you really think about it, we haven't had a great villain since, what, 2012? There have been some good smaller side villains over the years, but a lot of the big ones in these recent games don't compare to the likes of those original villains. Assassin's Creed is not a series known for its villains, it's more known for its protagonists, but that's just because there hasn't been that many good villains. Hopefully this is something the series can improve at, more so going forward with its stories, but I think a lot of these villains don't even get the chance to be further written or fleshed out with how limited their presence is in the actual game. A lot of these antagonists aren't even bad, a lot of them are just mediocre because you hardly see them in some of these games. Anyways, this is something I've noticed for a while now, and I always felt the villains in Assassin's Creed have been very lacking when compared to other long-running franchises. Again, like Far Cry. I'm hoping we get a strong central antagonist to take down in Codename Red, but we'll see how that goes. I'm curious though, what do you guys think are the best villains of the series, and why have they become so lackluster as of late? Do you agree that some of these antagonists need more significant screen time? Let me know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing to the channel if you're new. And other than that, thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.